Okay, so there are a lot of manuscripts which compare very favourably with other ancient documents, which we never question. But what evidence is there that the Gospels were ever written by the authors to whom they are ascribed? To start with, the theory that the Gospels were written by anonymous authors suffers from one large problem. There is not a single of these anonymous Gospels in existence, not one. A further problem is that of the copies of the Gospels we do have, all of them are attributed to the same author. If the names were stuck on at a later date to make them sound more credible, then the same Gospel would be attributed to Matthew here, Peter there, and Philip further off yet. But no, all the copies of Mark are attributed to Mark, all the copies of John are attributed to John, and so on. Furthermore, the Church Fathers, those early church theologians who wrestled with questions of doctrine in the decades and centuries after Christ's death and resurrection, are unanimous in accepting the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What is also telling is that when a number of fakes were written in the 2nd century, purporting to be by Peter, Thomas, or Judas, they were equally unanimous in condemning these as fraudulent. You have to remember that some of these church fathers lived close in time to the actual events. Irenaeus, for example, was a disciple of Polycarp, who in turn was a disciple of the Apostle John. At no point does Irenaeus question who wrote these Gospels. Furthermore, not only do the church fathers never doubt who wrote the Gospels, in many of their writings some actively affirm who wrote them. Take this from Papias, a disciple of John. This is what he says. Matthew composed the sayings in the Hebrew dialect, and each person interpreted them as best he could. For he made it his concern not to admit anything that he heard, or to make any false statement in them. Or take this from Justin Martyr, who died in AD 165. For in the memoirs of the apostles and their successors it is written. Or this from Irenaeus, who died in AD 202. Now Matthew published among the Hebrews a written gospel also in their own language, while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome and founding the church. When a New Testament text is anonymous, however, then there is lots of debate about who wrote it. This is the case regarding the letters to the Hebrews. Who wrote it? Was it Paul? Was it Barnabas? Or maybe one of the other apostles? Was it someone else in the early church? No one knows, which led Origen, a brilliant theologian from the 4th century, to throw his hands up and declare, as to who wrote the epistle to the Hebrews, only God knows. There is not a trace of such debate regarding the authorship of the Gospels, however. Still, even if we accept that the Gospels were written by the 4 evangelists, how can we be sure that the text has not materially changed, given that the originals were copied and recopied throughout the centuries? In answering this question, it is interesting to imagine Erasmus labouring over the first ever published Greek New Testament in book form at the time of the Reformation in the 16th century. The original New Testament scrolls were written in ancient Greek. When Erasmus wrote his version of the Gospels, the oldest Greek texts he relied on dated back to the 12th century. 5 centuries on, we now have access to nearly 1,000 times more manuscripts, some complete New Testaments, as shown above, dating as early as the 4th century. And what do we find? That those 4th century copies are pretty well exactly the same as those 12th century copies used by Erasmus over a millennium later. The constant recopying of the text has been as near perfect as it is possible to be. So who were these 4 writers? Now Matthew is described in the Gospel of the same name as a tax collector, who Jesus called to be one of his disciples. We know quite a lot about Mark from Paul's letters to the churches he founded and the book of Acts. He is described as a cousin of Barnabas, a companion of Peter, and stayed with Paul during his imprisonment. So he was not an apostle, but was a close confidant of the 2 greatest apostles of the early church. Luke is identified as a Gentile, meaning non-Jewish physician, who stayed with Paul during his imprisonment and thus knew Mark. Finally, John was a fisherman, described as the beloved disciple, who was a close friend of Jesus and, along with Mary, his mother, was at the foot of the cross during his crucifixion. So did they know their Jerusalem from their Jericho, as it were? Apart from the testimony of the Church Fathers to the authorship of the Gospels, we have the testimony of the Gospels themselves. All the Gospels show an innate knowledge of the first century Judea, which is as intimate as it is taken for granted. The contrast with the later forgeries that are the second century Gospels of Thomas, Peter, or Judas could not be greater. All the writers show that they know the geography of Judea from the well-known to the completely obscure. Tiny villages are named, Bethany, Enion, Cana, Salem, which are correctly quoted together in the Gospels when they are together geographically, as in this verse, "Woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida." The Gospel writers get it right in talking of going down to Jericho from Jerusalem, certainly the right description, going from a city which is 750 metres above sea level, which is Jerusalem, to the lowest city on earth, which is Jericho, which is 250 metres below sea level. When botanical information is given in the Gospels, it again fits in. Zacchaeus is seen climbing into a sycamore tree, which are prolific around Jericho, but which do not grow in North Mediterranean countries. When Jesus is heard debating the tithing of mint, dill, and cumin, we see this matching up with other evidence of rabbinic debates of the tithing of dill and cumin. Then is the very Jewish flavour of the Gospels. The whole of the New Testament shows a profound knowledge of the Jewish religion. Matthew, for example, quoting from the Old Testament 55 times. Now, the importance of this stretches beyond the obvious conclusion that the Gospels were written by people who were either Jewish or with a deep knowledge of Judaism. Given that Christianity rapidly became a predominantly Gentile faith, any late dating of the Gospels is simply not credible. By the 2nd century, the Jewish origins of the Christian religion would have been rapidly fading from its increasingly Gentile-peopled churches, so that an intimate knowledge of Judaism would have faded with it. This is what we see in the 2nd century Gospels of Thomas, Peter, etc., which are thought to have been composed in Egypt. Not only do they show a very limited knowledge of the geography of Judea, their knowledge of Judaism is equally scant. One fascinating final point on names is worth mentioning, as it is the fruit of research from the last few decades. One of the most interesting biblical scholars alive today is Richard Bauckham, who in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses explains the fruit of his research in names at the time of Jesus. He has painstakingly made a list of 2,953 occurrences of 593 Jewish names in all available sources, namely gravestones, parchments, etc., which existed in the 1st century around the Mediterranean, which we have available now. In the early 1st century, there were an estimated 650,000 Jews living in Judea and 2.6 million outside its borders, many around the Mediterranean, but also going as far east as modern-day Iraq. As you would expect, the names which Jewish communities gave to their children depended on where they lived. This research shows that the most common name in Palestine at the time was Simon and Mary. Given the prevalence of such names in Palestine, the Gospel writers would have to use disambiguators to distinguish one Simon or Mary from another. So you get lots of disambiguators or hyphenated add-ons such as Simon Peter, Mary Magdalene, James the son of Alphaeus, etc. However, for much less common names such as Thomas or Bartholomew, these hyphenated names were never used in the Gospels because simply you didn't need to. This is the sort of local knowledge which in life you don't even think about. In a similar way today, you immediately know that someone called Gladys, Ethel or Edith will be of an older generation given how fashions for baby names change over time. This local knowledge of names in the Gospels helps us to date the authors to a locality and a time. If we look at the names used by the 2nd century forgeries of Thomas, Peter or Judas, no such local knowledge of 1st century Jewish names appears in their inverted commas Gospels. So when were the Gospels written? As I said before, it really is anybody's guess as to when these Gospels were actually written. The range of theories goes from just a few years after the events to over a century later, with the general consensus being around 30 to 50 years after Christ's crucifixion. This modern-day consensus thus implicitly accepts that the Gospels were written within the lifetime of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, rather than being much later works by anonymous editors. But even this earlier dating is very much up for debate. The most important reason why some theories place Matthew and Luke to the late 70s or 80s is the dating of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, Jesus regularly prophesied the fall of the temple. So the theory goes, given that the prophecy was fulfilled, rather than it being proofs of Jesus' prophetic power, it is rather a useful means of dating the Gospels to after the fall of the temple. The assumption being that it is far more likely that the Gospel writers put these prophecies into Jesus' mouth after the event than that Jesus was vindicated in his prophecies. Now, there are several problems with such skepticism. First of all, it is not as if Jesus was alone in making such prophecies. According to Josephus, in AD 66, a man called Jesus, the son of Ananias, drew on the Old Testament book of Jeremiah to predict that Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed. Secondly, even if you are sceptical as to Jesus' claim to divinity, there is an easier solution to the inspiration for Jesus' prophecy. Rather than assume that the fall of the temple in AD 70 was retrospectively written into the Gospels by his star-struck followers, there is another more obvious answer. Jesus' teaching was soaked into his knowledge of the Scriptures. And in these Scriptures, another fall of the temple is described in 586 BC, when Jerusalem was sacked and burned by the king of Babylon. That seems a much more obvious source of inspiration for his prophecies of the fall of the temple. Finally, it is certainly odd that at no point in the Gospels is there a comment saying, "And look, Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of the temple has been fulfilled." It is not as if the New Testament authors never do this. Look at what Luke says in the book of Acts. Now in these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. And this took place in the days of Claudius. The book of Acts is itself a real problem for the late dating of the Gospels. The consensus is that Luke wrote his Gospel and the subsequent book of Acts after Mark and Matthew. Luke must have known Mark, given that they both travelled with and knew Paul. Dating Luke after Mark and Matthew makes sense, given the introduction to his own Gospel, where he says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seems good to me also, having followed all things closely for some times past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." So he's basically implying that he wrote it after some already existing Gospels. If we accept then that Luke was not the first evangelist, what do we make about the end of the book of Acts? This ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome, where it says, "And he lived there 2 years at his own expense, and welcomed all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ quite openly and unhindered." That's the end of the book of Acts. Now, Paul's house arrest is dated AD 62, and surely the most plausible explanation for its ending at that point is that Paul's beheading outside Rome, which is usually dated to the persecution under Nero in AD 65, had not happened yet. If you make this common sense assumption, then that would put the writing of Mark and Matthew to a date prior to the mid-60s also. Let us take a break here. So far we have looked at how the New Testament compares incomparably better than any other ancient literature in terms of the sheer number of documents available to scholars and their comparative closeness in time to the events described. We have also looked at why ascribing authorship of the Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke and John makes much more sense than competing theories. In our next section, we will look at the texts themselves and see what Jesus claimed about himself.